The wind stopped first. That was the wrong thing to notice. But it's the thing I noticed. And I've come to believe that the wrong thing you notice at the start of a catastrophe is usually the truest thing. Because your mind grabs the small detail it can hold instead of the large one it can't. I'd spent 41 years on the flat land west of Murdo, South Dakota. And I knew the sound of a plane storm the way you know your own heartbeat. Which is to say, I didn't think about it at all until it changed. A storm out here doesn't sneak up. It builds. You feel it in your teeth an hour before you see it. It moans through the fence wire in a long rising note. And it rattles the loose panel on the machine shed that I'd been meaning to screw down for 2 summers. And it pushes the tall grass over in silver waves that run toward you across the whole visible earth. What it does not do, ever, is quit. It doesn't just stop. But at 6:52 that evening, I know the time because I looked at my watch a second later. The way you check a clock when reality skips a beat, standing at the top of the concrete stairs, with my hand flat on the cold steel of the shelter's hatch. The wind died like somebody had put a hand over the world's mouth. And in that silence, that unnatural pressed flat silence, I heard my neighbor Del Corliss screaming from his property a half-mile east. Sound carries strange on the plains when the air goes still. It came to me clear and close, as if he were standing at the bottom of my drive. And the scream did not sound like a man who was afraid of weather. It sounded like a man who was being taken apart. My name is Warren Aldous. I raise cattle, or I did, black baldies mostly. On a section and a half my grandfather proved up, and my father held through the 80s when a lot of men didn't. I want to tell you exactly what happened in the 12 days my family and I spent underground and on the road, because most of what people believe about that first week of the outbreak is wrong, and the parts that are true are worse than the lies. I'm not a dramatic man. My wife will tell you I'm barely a talkative one. But I've decided some things need saying plainly by somebody who was there. And I was there, with my hand on that hatch. And I want you to be there too. Before I go on, I just want to say thank you to the folks who keep coming back to sit with these stories. And if this is your first time here, you're welcome at this fire too. If this kind of grounded survival story is what you come looking for, stay with the channel and leave a word in the comments. It genuinely helps more people find these. Now let me take you back to that hatch, and the reason I didn't go help Del Corliss die. My daughter had my wrist. Not my hand, my wrist. Both her hands wrapped around it the way she used to grab it when she was 4, and we crossed the highway to the feed store. Except June was 15 now, and strong from a year of hauling square bales and wrestling calves at branding. And she was pulling me down the stairs with everything she had, her whole weight thrown back against mine. Dad, the road. Her voice was flat and careful, and that flatness frightened me more than any scream could have. Because June was not a flat and careful girl. June was loud. June argued with the radio. June had opinions about everything and delivered them at full volume across the supper table. A June who had gone quiet, and even was a June who had already seen something she decided she couldn't afford to feel yet. I looked past Del's place, past the dark line of his shelter belt trees, to the county road that ran north toward the interstate. And I saw the thing that made me stop being a neighbor and start being a father. There were people coming up the road on foot, a lot of them. In the last orange light before dark, that low burning light we get out here when the sun sits right on the edge of the world, I counted maybe 20. And they were spread across both lanes and slopped down into the ditches on either side. And they were moving at that particular broken run of someone who has forgotten they have knees. It's hard to describe if you haven't seen it. A living person running is a series of controlled falls, caught each time by a foot placed just right. These weren't caught. They pitched forward and their legs scrambled to keep up, and sometimes the legs lost, and a body would go down hard into the ditch grass and then get up wrong, get up in pieces, and come on. Some of them were coming from the direction of the wrecked cars I'd seen backed up on the interstate all afternoon. The traffic jam that the radio kept calling an isolated public health incident. Until, around 4 o'clock, the radio stopped calling it anything at all and started playing a tone. I got June down the stairs. I got my wife Ilsa down after her. Ilsa, who'd come running up from the garden with dirt still on her knees when she heard the first sirens on the interstate. Ilsa, who hadn't asked a single question because she'd taken one look at my face in the yard and known that questions were a luxury we no longer had. And I got Petter down after her, my son, 11 years old, who had not said one word since we'd stood at the fence line an hour before and watched, through my binoculars, a state trooper up on the interstate overpass empty his sidearm into a man who would not stop walking toward him. The man had kept walking after the first shot, after the third. Petter had lowered the binoculars very slowly and handed them back to me and had not spoken since. Ilsa carried the dog. That's a detail that sounds small and wasn't. Biscuit was a full-grown blue heeler, 40 pounds of muscle and nerve, and he'd never in his life been carried. But the wrongness in the air had gotten into him too, and he'd gone half wild. And he'd already bitten clean through the sleeve of Ilsa's flannel shirt in his panic, drawn blood on her forearm. And she carried him anyway, pinned against her chest, murmuring to him in Danish, the low sing-song she used on frightened animals and frightened children. And I pulled the hatch down over the 4 of us, and the animal, that heavy steel plate my grandfather had salvaged off a decommissioned missile relay and hung on hinges the size of my forearm. And I dropped it into its frame with a boom that I felt in the soles of my feet. And I threw the interior bolt, a length of 1.25 inch steel that slid into a socket poured into the concrete. And on the other side of 18 inches of roof and 11 feet of prairie soil, Del Corliss kept screaming for another 90 seconds. And then he did not scream anymore, and the silence came back down over the top of us like water closing over a stone, dropped in a stock tank. Nobody spoke. The only sound was Biscuit panting, and Ilsa's breathing. And somewhere, the small tick of my grandfather's shelter settling around us, the way it had settled for 60 years. I want to describe this shelter to you, because the shelter is the whole story. And if you don't understand it, really understand it, the way I came to understand it, inch by inch, in the dark, you won't understand the choices we made, and you'll judge them wrong, the way I'd have judged them wrong myself a week earlier. My grandfather built it in 1962. Everybody calls it the storm shelter now, and it served as one plenty of times. The whole family piling down there while a wall cloud dragged its tail across the section. But he didn't build it for tornadoes. He was a Cold War man, a wheat and cattle man, who'd come home from the Pacific in '45 with a quietness in him that never fully left. And he'd read too many civil defense pamphlets about Soviet warheads coming over the pole. And Ellsworth Air Force Base sat just a couple 100 miles west of us, with its bombers, and later, its missile fields. And he'd done the arithmetic a scared man does and decided he was living inside a target. So he'd sunk a concrete box 11 feet under the horse pasture, up on the rise where the water table wouldn't reach it, with walls a foot thick and a poured roof 18 inches deep, reinforced with rail steel he'd hauled home from a torn-up siding. It was not one of those slick, prefab fiberglass pods you see advertised now on late-night television, the ones with the granular filters and the LED strips and the composting heads. It was a bunker in the true and heavy sense of the word. It was a rectangular room, roughly 20 feet by 14, with walls that wept moisture in the spring thaw and a floor of troweled concrete that stayed the same cool underground temperature, no matter what August did to the world overhead. Down there, summer and winter, it was always a little under 60 degrees and always smelled faintly of dust and cold stone and the linseed oil my grandfather had rubbed into the wooden shelving. There was one way in, the stairwell hatch we'd come through, 12 concrete steps down from the pasture to the steel door. And there was one other opening to the outside world. And that opening is going to matter more than anything else. I tell you tonight, so hold on to it. Keep it in your hand as I talk. A ventilation shaft. My grandfather, being a careful man, a man who did nothing halfway, had not trusted a simple pipe punched through the roof. He knew from those pamphlets, from the engineers who wrote them, that a nuclear blast wave would travel down a straight pipe and turn a shelter into an oven and a coffin in the same instant. So he'd built the fresh air intake as an L-shaped concrete duct. It ran horizontally away from the shelter for about 15 feet underground before it turned and rose to the surface, so that any blast pressure would break itself against that 90-degree corner instead of coming straight down our throats. At the surface end, there was a hooded intake, screened with fine brass mesh against mice and grasshoppers and the fine dust of a dry year. And he'd disguised the whole thing. This was pure him, as one of the weathered gray posts of an old cattle loading chute that stood, half-fallen and forgotten, out in the middle of the pasture. To any eye, it was junk. To us, it was a windpipe. Air came in through that shaft. Bad air, the air we breathed out, went back to the surface through a smaller companion pipe on the far wall. And the whole system was driven by a hand-cranked blower my grandfather had scavenged off a played-out gold mine's ventilation rig down in the Black Hills. It was a heavy cast-iron thing, a squirrel cage fan the size of a wash bucket, driven by a flywheel and a leather belt off a hand crank. Geared so that a man turning the crank at a steady walking pace would move real air through the room. I had greased that blower and dressed that leather belt and checked those seals every single autumn of my adult life, part of the ritual of putting the place to bed for winter. And I had done it every year with the calm, distant, slightly superior feeling of a man maintaining something he is certain he will never actually need. We had food. My family aren't preppers in the paranoid camouflage and conspiracy sense, but we live 90 minutes from a real grocery store over roads that drift shut for weeks at a time in a bad winter. So we keep deep the way ranch families out here have always kept deep. There were shelves of home-canned beef and green beans and stewed tomatoes, jars Ilse and June had put up in August with the pressure canner rocking on the stove, the lids pinging as they sealed. There was a 50-pound barrel of hard red wheat and jerky in a lidded crock, and powdered milk and coffee and salt, and enough water in stacked 5-gallon jugs and a 200-gallon cistern set into the floor beneath a hatch to last 4 people and a dog a long, long time. My grandfather had plumbed rain off the pasture windmill stock tank overflow into that cistern decades ago, and I'd kept it clean. There was a chemical toilet in a curtained alcove in the far corner, a 5-gallon affair with a bag system and a jug of blue deodorizer. There was a wood stove, a little cast-iron box with a flue that ran up beside the exhaust pipe. And it was useless to us now, because I could not light a fire that pushed smoke out of that pasture post and painted a signal across the evening sky that said, here we are, come and see. There was a shelf of my grandfather's books, Louis L'Amour paperbacks with the spines gone white, a Bible, a repair manual for a tractor that hadn't run since Nixon. There was a wind-up flashlight, a battery lantern with a stack of spare D-cells, a box of stubby candles, and an old shortwave radio the size of a lunchbox, a Zenith transoceanic with a fold-down antenna and a dial that glowed faint amber when you switched it on. And there was the smell, which I noticed on the very first night and told myself was nothing. It was a faint sweetness threaded into the incoming air, like fruit going over, like a peach left too long on a warm windowsill, that first turn before real rot, the sweetness that's almost pleasant until you understand what it is. I told myself it was the tomatoes, a jar with a bad seal somewhere on the shelf. I told myself the linseed oil, the dust, the cistern. I told myself a great many things that first night. And I believed about half of them, which is a better rate than I managed on most of the nights that came after. The four of us sat in the yellow lantern light. I decided we'd run the battery lantern low and save the candles. Small economies, the mind reaching for anything it can control. And we listened to the shortwave and did not talk about Dell. Ilsa held Petter against her side and stroked his hair in a slow, steady rhythm that I understood was more for her hand than for his head. June sat with her back flat against the cold concrete of the far wall and her knees pulled up to her chest, and she watched the hatch. I noticed that she'd chosen her spot deliberately. She'd sat down where she had a clean sight line up the stairwell to the steel door, the only door, and she kept her eyes on it. And I understood, watching her, that whatever this was had already taken something out of my daughter that I was not going to be able to put back. And that the girl who watched a door like that was a girl who had decided, at 15, that safety was a thing you had to personally guarantee because the adults could not. The shortwave gave us fragments through the crackle and fade. A man's voice, professional, a broadcaster's cadence but frayed at the edges with exhaustion, reading a rotation of instructions on a loop. Shelter in place. Do not approach the affected. Do not attempt to render aid to the affected, regardless of relationship. The condition is transmitted by fluid contact and by bite. Onset of symptoms within 20 minutes to 2 hours of exposure. Then a different voice, a woman, clipped and military, reading strings of numbers and grid coordinates that meant nothing to me, over and over. Then long, dead stretches of that tone, that flat electronic tone, that I would come to hate more than any sound in my life. And once, around midnight by my watch, we caught something that had plainly not been meant for us. A ham operator, somewhere out in the dark, keying up on a band that bled into the shortwave, talking fast and low and close to his microphone, the way a man talks when he's afraid of being overheard by the things in his own house. They don't stop for cold. Everybody keeps saying wait for winter, wait for the first hard freeze to knock 'em down like it does the flies. But I'm telling you, it doesn't work. They don't stop for cold. I watched one stand out in the creek all night. Water up past its waist, ice forming on it. And come morning it just turned and walked up the bank and then he was gone, cut off mid-word. And there was only the hiss. I turned the radio off to save the batteries. That was a decision, and I remember making it, because it was the last simple decision I got to make down there. After that, every single decision cost something, and I found out fast that a man who's used to problems with clean answers, a fence is up or it's down, a calf lives or it dies, a well pumps or it doesn't, is not prepared for problems where every answer is also a wound. Ilsa and I had married in the little white Lutheran church in Draper 20 years back. She'd come over from Denmark as an agriculture exchange student, a serious girl who'd meant to learn American feedlot practice and go home, and instead learned me and never left. She had a way, in a crisis, of going very quiet and very practical, while I went the other direction, loud and busy and grabbing at tasks. It's why we've lasted. That first night, once Pater had finally slumped into an exhausted sleep against her, She looked at me across the lantern and said, in that low, even accent that 20 years of South Dakota had never quite sanded off, "Warren, we should decide now how we count the days, and who runs the blower, and how much water each. If we decide it now, while we are calm, we don't argue it later when we are frightened. Frightened people cannot divide a jar of water fairly." She was right. She was almost always right about the shape of a problem, even the time she was wrong about the middle of it. So we made our arrangements in whispers over the sleeping boy. I'd run the blower, an hour at a time, 4 times a day, morning, midday, evening, and once in the deep of the night, to keep the air turning over. June would keep the food, take the inventory, set and enforce the rations, because she was ferocious about fairness and would not let a single person, least of all herself, take one bite more than a share. Ilsa would keep Petter and keep the log, marking the days and the water and anything we heard. And Petter, we told him gently when he woke, Petter's job was Biscuit. Keep the dog fed, keep the dog calm, keep the dog quiet. He nodded, once, and it was the first thing he'd responded to since the overpass. And I saw Ilsa's shoulders come down half an inch when he did. We slept in shifts, or tried to. And in the morning, though, morning meant nothing 11 feet down. Just the hands of my watch reading 7:15. And a body that had given up on real rest, I climbed the 12 concrete steps and put my ear flat against the cold steel of the hatch, and I listened to the world we'd left. There was movement up there. I want to be precise about this, because precision is close to the only honest thing I've got to offer. It was not the sound of a crowd. It was the sound of a few. Footsteps, dragging, unhurried, across the gravel of my own yard. A scuff and a pause and a scuff. A slow, heavy bumping against the corrugated side of the machine shed, on and off, like an animal leaning on a fence. And once this is the part I've never gotten out from under, directly over the hatch, a weight settled. I felt the faint give of it through the steel against my cheek. And then a long, slow scraping, 5 fingers, I'd swear to it, dragging across the plate, back and forth, feeling for the seam, feeling for the edge, the way you'd run your hand over a wall in the dark, hunting for a light switch. I did not breathe. I made myself into stone. The scraping went on for maybe 30 seconds that lasted a year, and then the weight lifted, and the dragging footsteps moved off toward the shed, and I came back down the stairs on legs that had stopped fully belonging to me. And I told my family the yard was clear. That was my first lie to them, and I told it, looking my wife in the eye. I told myself it was mercy, that they didn't need to carry what I'd just heard, that a father's job is to stand between his people and the worst of a thing. I've had a great deal of time since to think about whether mercy and cowardice wear the same coat. And I've come to believe that sometimes they do, that the same soft impulse that spares a person pain can also spare you the hard work of being honest with them. And that only you, in the dark of your own head, know which one you were really serving. The first 2 days we found a rhythm, and the rhythm was almost bearable. And that frightened me worse than chaos would have, because I knew in my gut it couldn't hold. 11 feet of dirt and 1.5 feet of concrete is a fine insulator against a great many things. But it is no insulator at all against time. And time was the thing that was going to hurt us. It was going to hurt us through the air. I cranked the blower on the schedule we'd set. The flywheel was heavy at the start of each hour, resisting, and then it built its momentum and ran smoother. And I fell into the rhythm of it, a steady walking cadence, right hand then left. And I watched the little ribbon Ilsa had tied to the intake grill lift and flutter to prove the air was moving. After an hour, My shoulders and the base of my neck burned in a deep way, and the leather belt slipped and squealed when my hands sweated onto the crank, and I'd have to stop and chalk them with dust from the floor. But the air stayed breathable, and the sweet peach smell faded most of the way out while the fresh air came through. And I took that as evidence for my own comfortable lie. See, it's the tomatoes. It clears when the air moves. There's nothing wrong. On the third day, I ran out of ways to tell myself that. I'd finished the noon crank, and I was sitting on the floor with my back against the wall beside the big square cast iron grill, where the L-shaped duct delivered the pasture air into the room, catching my breath. And Biscuit came over and lay down next to me the way he did, heavy against my leg. And then he got up again. He went to the grill, and he lowered his head to the vent, and he started to whine. Not bark. Whine, low in his throat, his ears pinned flat back against his skull, and his lip just barely lifted. The exact way a good dog behaves when he's found a snake under the porch, and he's smart enough not to grab it. The hair stood up along his spine in a ridge. I got down on my hands and knees, and I put my own face close to the grill, and I breathed in slow through my nose. And there it was, stronger than the night before, the sweetness, and now, under the sweetness, riding beneath it, something else. Something I knew in my body from 20 years of pulling dead calves in the cold and finding winter-killed cattle bloated in the coulees when the snow went off in April. It was the smell of a body starting to turn. It was rising out of the ground and coming into us on the very air I'd been so proud to keep moving. I did the arithmetic standing right there over the grill, and the arithmetic was ugly. The intake ran 15 feet out through the ground and turned up at the old chute post in the middle of the pasture. If something dead was lying near that post, and something was, then every time I cranked that blower, 4 times a day, every day, for as long as we were down here, I would be pulling the smell and the corruption of it down into our lungs. And if I stopped cranking the blower to spare us that, then the air in the room would go stale and thick, and we would smother in our own breath. There was no third setting on the machine. There was breathe the death or breathe nothing. I didn't tell the family what the smell was. I told them I was going to look at the intake. June turned her head and gave me the flat, careful look she'd been giving me since the overpass, and she said, "Look at it how? There's no way to get at that pipe without going out the hatch." She wasn't being smart with me. She was just, at 15, incapable of pretending a problem was smaller than it was, which is a gift and a burden both. I didn't have an answer for her, so I said I'd think on it, which is a father's oldest way of saying, I don't know, a code that children stop believing somewhere around the age of 10, and are usually kind enough not to say so. Here is the trap my grandfather built without ever knowing he was building it, and I want you to sit inside it with me for a second, because it's the whole engine of what came after. A shelter with one door and one air supply is safe from nearly everything the world can throw at it, from weather, from fire, from fallout, from a mob with torches. It is safe from every single thing except a problem that develops inside the air supply itself. And now we had exactly that problem. And there was no way on God's earth to fix it from inside the sealed room. And the only route to the outside was up the stairwell and through the hatch. And on the other side of that hatch were the things that scraped their fingers across the steel, feeling for a seam. If you'd been down there with us, 3 days in, breathing that sweetness and that rot 4 times a day, watching your children start to move slower, listening to a good dog whine at a wall he couldn't understand, what would you have done? I've turned that question over more times than I can count, and I've heard a lot of confident answers from people who weren't there, and I'm still not certain a single one of them is right. That night, I couldn't sleep, which was nothing new. But this was a different kind of not sleeping. A churning kind. Somewhere past 2 by my watch, I got up in the dark, careful not to wake the others. And I went to my grandfather's shelf and took down the dented tin box, an old first aid case, where he'd always kept the shelter's papers. I don't honestly know what I was after. Comfort, I suppose. A hand reaching down to me from a man 20 years in his grave in the Draper Cemetery. What I found instead was the second thing that changed everything. And it was his own log. A fat, water-stained notebook. The cover soft as cloth from handling. That I'd flipped through as a boy and never once actually read. He'd made an entry for every year he serviced the place, from 1962 clear through to 1994, the autumn before he died. Most of it was the dry poetry of maintenance. Greased the blower bearings, dressed the belt, replaced the intake screen, mice, checked the door seal, sound, cistern low, dry summer. But in the fall of 1971, there was a long entry, pages of his tight, blocky pencil, and it was about the air. He wrote that during a hard, cold snap that winter, he'd sealed himself into the shelter alone for 4 days as a test. To know the thing before I need it, he'd written, which was precisely like him. A man who would never trust a tool he hadn't personally driven to failure. And he wrote that on the 3rd day of his test, the air had gone bad on him. Sweet, he wrote, sweet and thick and heavy, and he'd nearly talked himself into believing the ventilation had failed, that the blower wasn't moving enough, until he'd worked out the real trouble. The intake drew from ground level out in the pasture. And in a still, hard, cold snap, the low ground held the heavy air. The settled air, he called it. The dense, dead, oxygen-poor air that pools in the hollows and the low places on a windless, cold night. He was breathing the bottom of the atmosphere. And then he wrote a solution, and my hands went cold reading it. Because it meant we might live. There was a second intake. I read it 3 times over to be sure I wasn't inventing it out of hope. My grandfather, in 1971, alone and half-poisoned in this very room, had solved the settled air problem by running a second, higher intake. A length of galvanized pipe up the north leg of the old cattle windmill tower that still stood at the top of the rise, 100 yards off from the shelter. The tower put the pipe's mouth up 30-odd feet in the air, up where the wind never fully quits even on a still night, up in the moving, mixing, living air. The idea was simple, and it was brilliant. When the low pasture air went sour, you switched the blower to draw from up high instead. He'd built a diverter into the duct where the 2 intakes joined underground, a manual valve, a lever, and he'd drawn a careful little diagram of it in the margin. And the valve was on our side of the wall, inside the sealed room, behind the grill, within reach of my own hand. I want you to feel the size of what that meant to me, crouched there at 2:30 in the morning, with a wind-up flashlight going dim in my fist and a dead man's handwriting in the other. It meant we were not trapped by the air after all. It meant that there was a fix, a real one, and the fix lay on our side of the concrete, and I would not have to throw the bolt and lift the hatch and go up into the yard where the fingers scraped. I nearly woke Ilse to tell her. I nearly wept, and I am not, as I've said, a man who does that. And then I read the last line of the 1971 entry. And I stopped, and the cold that went through me was a different cold entirely. He'd written, "The high intake at the windmill draws clean, but it draws loud. Whatever is out there hears the tower breathe." I sat with that line for a long time in the dark. My grandfather had built a way to survive the bad air. And almost 60 years ago, testing his fear of Russian bombs, he had noted as a curiosity, a quirk of the physics, A footnote that the fix made a sound at the surface. The long column of pipe up the tower resonated when the blower pulled hard through it. It hummed. It moaned. To him, it had meant nothing worse than a strange noise on a cold night. To me, reading it in the 3rd year of my life that this thing had already broken, it read like a warning shouted down a well across 6 decades. Because the things that were above ground now were not fallout. Fallout doesn't have ears. Fallout doesn't press its hand to a steel door and feel for the seam. And I was going to open a valve that would make the top of that rise breathe like a living, dying thing right out in the open, in the exact place they could hear it. But the low air was already killing us, one slow, careful breath at a time. And the high air might get us killed fast, all at once, in the dark, at the door. That was the whole shape of it. That was the entire game. And I understood it fully sitting on that cold floor at 2:30 in the morning. And I did not sleep at all. And when 7:15 came around on my watch, I was still sitting there with the notebook open on my knees. And I'd made a decision. I was going to tell them everything. The lie about the yard being clear was going to be the last one I told. Because I'd worked out in the dark that a family that isn't allowed to share the danger cannot be asked to share the decision. And I was going to need every one of them for the decision that was coming. In the morning, I told them, all of it, that the smell in the air was a body out at the intake post, that the low pipe was slowly poisoning us, that my grandfather had left us a second intake up the windmill, and a valve behind the grill to switch to it, and that the switch would make a noise at the surface that could bring the dead. Ilsa took it the way she took nearly everything, by walking straight past the fear and into the practical center of it. How loud is loud? Did he write a number, a comparison, anything? He hadn't. Then we cannot know until we test it. Short, 1 minute, no more. We run it, and someone listens at the hatch, and if nothing comes through the door, we know it is not so loud, and we can breathe. June disagreed, and when June disagreed, it was worth setting down your own opinion and picking hers up to look at, because she thought about things from angles the rest of us didn't. If we test it, and something does come, she said, slow and even, then we've told them we're here, and we spent our one secret for nothing. We got nowhere out of a 1-minute test. We just announced ourselves. She turned the flashlight over in her hands. As long as they don't know for sure there are people breathing under this pasture, we're just a steel plate in the dirt. That's the most valuable thing we've got that they're not sure. I don't think we spend it on a test. I think we only ever switch it when we've got no choice left. And when we do, we run it long enough to be worth it, and we're ready for what comes. She was 15, and she was treating our own location as a strategic resource, a thing that could be spent exactly once. And she was dead right about it. Petter spoke then, quietly. The first full sentence he'd offered since the 3rd day. He had his hand buried in the ruff of Biscuit's neck. Biscuit will bark, he said. When they come, if they come, he'll bark, and then they'll know for sure. And the 4 of us looked at the dog, and the dog looked back at us with his ears up and his head cocked, trusting us. And nobody said a word, because the boy was right. And the next thought that followed his thought was not a thought any of us was willing to say out loud yet. We opened the grill first, just to see the valve, before we decided anything at all. It took me the better part of an hour on my knees, with a flat blade screwdriver from the tin box, backing out fasteners that had rusted into their threads, working slow so the screwdriver wouldn't slip and clatter, because I'd learned by then that every sharp sound in the room went somewhere. And behind the grill, set into the concrete of the duct exactly where the diagram promised, was the diverter. A heavy cast-iron lever, thick as my thumb, painted over so many times across the decades that the coats had fused it into a single lump. Below it, scratched raw into the wet troweled concrete of 1962 with a nail or a screwdriver point, were two words in my grandfather's blunt capitals: low and high, an arrow scored beside each, the arrows pointing which way to throw the lever for which. The lever sat hard over it low. I put my hand on it and leaned my weight, and it did not move a hair. 60 years of paint and rust holding it fast. And I thought, with a sinking feeling, that even freeing this thing was going to make noise inside the room before it ever made a sound up at the tower. I want to tell you about the fourth day, because the fourth day was when the outbreak stopped being a thing on the radio and a thing behind a steel door, and became a thing that was in the room with us. Even though nothing physical ever came through the wall, it came through the wall anyway. It came through the pipe. We hadn't switched the valve. We were still living it back and forth between us in the low, careful way you argue when you're rationing your own strength, and you know the other person is scared in exactly the same shape you are. And the low air kept getting worse by the hour. The sweetness was long gone. It had ripened into a real stench now, a wet green rot that got into the back of the throat and stayed there, that flavored the water and the food and every breath. And Petter had started getting headaches, gripping the sides of his head and going pale. And I knew precisely what that meant. Not enough good air, too much of the bad. We'd started cranking the blower less on our own, without discussing it, all of us instinctively drawing the poison down less often, and cranking less meant the air in the room went thick and used up and stale, so that we were caught in a vice with a killing jaw on either side. Around midday, I was at the open grill, on my knees, my ear turned to the mouth of the duct, listening. For what, I couldn't have told you. Listening the way you stand at the stall door of a sick animal in the night, needing to hear it breathe. And through 15 feet of concrete pipe drifting down from the chute post out in the pasture, I heard something move. It was not the wind, because there wasn't any wind. Hadn't been since 6:52 on the first evening. It was a shifting of weight. And then a sound. A wet, thick, tearing sound. And then a pause. And then it came again. Patient, rhythmic. And every hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight up as I understood what I was hearing. Something was out there at the chute post, right on top of my intake. And it was feeding. It was feeding on the body I'd been smelling for 4 days. And through my grandfather's clever, blast-baffling L-shaped duct, built to carry pasture air down to us gently and safe. I could hear each soft, deliberate, tearing sound of it as clearly as if the thing were kneeling in the room with me, 3 feet from my face. I put the grill back. I set it into place, and I ran the screws in fast, and my hands were not steady, and I skinned 2 knuckles on the cast iron, and didn't feel it until later. And when I turned around from the wall, June was standing directly behind me. She'd come up silent on her sock feet, and she'd had her own ear to the room while I had mine to the pipe. And she'd heard it too. And the flat, careful mask she'd worn since the overpass had cracked clean across just for a second. Just 1 second into the face of a genuinely terrified 15-year-old kid. Eyes wide, mouth open, all the false calm gone. And then, while I watched, she put it back. She reached up inside herself and set the mask back over that scared face. And that 1 second of seeing what it cost her to hold herself together is one of the things I will carry to my own grave. "We can't use the low intake anymore," she said very quietly, very level. "Not even if the smell went away. We can hear it, Dad. Which means it can hear us. The pipe works both ways." She swallowed. "Every time you crank, every time somebody coughs, Petter's headaches when he moans. It all goes right up that pipe to whatever's sitting on the other end of it. She'd seen the whole trap at once, the entire thing, faster and cleaner than I had. The low intake wasn't only pumping rot into our lungs, it was a listening tube, a 15-foot concrete ear, aimed directly at the one spot on all my land where a dead thing had chosen to settle down and feed. Every sound we made was traveling up that pipe. My grandfather had built a shelter that could hear the surface, and it had never once occurred to him why would it, in 1962, hiding from bombs that the surface might one day be able to hear the shelter back. That was the midpoint of the whole thing. The moment the story of my grandfather's shelter turned itself inside out in my hands. For 4 days I'd understood the walls as protection, as a thing wrapped around us to keep the world off. Standing there with my skinned knuckles, listening to my daughter say the pipe works both ways, I understood at last that the walls had never been protection. They had only ever been concealment. And the concealment was failing, breath by breath. And the very system built to keep us alive was the exact seam where we were coming apart. We could not breathe the low air. We could not stay silent while we drew it. And the high air, the clean salvation up the windmill, would make a sound that called every hungry dead thing on that flat black land to the top of our rise. We had gone from a problem with one bad answer to a problem with two. And both of the answers had teeth in them. I called the family into the middle of the room, away from both walls, away from both pipes, and from then on, we whispered, always, mouths close to ears. And the whispering itself was a kind of grief, a daily reminder of exactly what we were and where. I laid it out as plain as I could. The low intake was poisoned, and it broadcast us. The high intake was clean, but it announced us. And doing nothing, just riding it out on the stale, banked air meant suffocating within a day or two once we stopped cranking altogether. So we had to switch to high. The only real questions left were when, and for how long, and what in God's name we did about the noise. Ilsa asked the question that turned out to matter most. If we switch to high, and they come to the tower for the sound, do they come to us? Is the tower far enough from the door? I made myself picture the layout of my own place from the inside of that room. The place I'd walked 10,000 times. The windmill tower stood a full 100 yards from the shelter, up at the top of the rise. The hatch was down here in the flat below it. And this was the thing I hadn't thought to mention, because it had seemed too small. I'd thrown a scatter of gray weathered lumber over the hatch on my way down that first evening. An armload of old corral planks off the pile, half by instinct, half by the same impulse that makes you pull a blanket over your head as a child. The hatch was hidden under junk in the flat. The tower stood tall and bare on the rise, 100 yards uphill. 100 yards. If the noise pulled them to the tower, and they stayed at the tower, crowding and shoving at the base of the steel legs and feeling the pipe hum under their hands, then 100 yards of dark pasture might be the whole difference between a bad night and the last night of our lives. The high intake might not merely save our lungs. It might work as a decoy. It might pull them off the hatch and up the hill. And that was the moment the plan turned from mere survival into something colder and more deliberate. And I felt it make the turn under me, and I let it. And I've had to live with the fact that I let it. I was going to use the windmill tower to draw the dead to the top of the rise, deliberately, away from my sleeping children, and by clean air and clear ground with the same lever. It was a good plan. It was, I understood even then, the plan of a man who has studied his enemy carefully enough to feed them something and steer them with it. And I hated that I was capable of thinking that way about the neighbors and strangers those things had been a week ago. And I was fiercely, animally proud that I was capable of it. And both of those things were true in me at the same time, which I've since learned is how nearly every real decision actually feels from the inside. We spent 2 days getting ready, and we could afford the 2 days because we discovered we could survive on almost no blower at all if we simply lay still, if we lay down in the middle of the room and slowed our breathing, and didn't move, and didn't talk, and didn't burn oxygen. We became something close to hibernating animals in a cold stone den. And the banked air lasted far longer than it had any right to. Petter's headaches eased once we quit drawing the rot down on him. We ate cold, straight from the jars, no stove. We spoke in whispers, with our lips against each other's ears. And in those 2 still, dim, careful days, a strange and terrible closeness settled over the 4 of us and the dog, all of us packed together in the center of that room, sharing the same slow airs like it was the last of the food, which, in the way that mattered, it was. I have never in my life been physically closer to my wife and my children. And I would not go back to those 2 days for anything on earth. I used the time to free the valve. I couldn't force it. Force meant a sharp crack of breaking paint and rust that would travel straight up the low pipe to whatever was still working at the post. So I worked it the way you work a frozen bolt you can't afford to snap. I dripped cooking oil down the shaft of the lever a drop at a time and let it wick down into the seized joint. I worked the lever a single hair back and forth over hours, using my grandfather's screwdriver as a cheater bar, with a rag wrapped around it to smother the metal on metal sound. Drip, wait, work, wait. On the second evening, it gave at last a slow, low, grinding 1/4 inch of movement that made me freeze with my heart in my throat, listening at the pipe for anything above to react. And then another hour of patient working. It moved free, swinging on its pivot low to high and back with 2 fingers. I sat back against the wall, soaked through with sweat, and looked at those 2 scratched words in the 60-year-old concrete, low and high. And I understood I was sitting with my hand on a switch that would decide whether my whole family lived or died. Because that was exactly what it was, before I threw it. I have to tell you what we decided about the dog, because it's the part of this I have never told to another living soul. And it is, in the end, the real reason I'm telling any of it at all. Biscuit would bark. We all knew it, in our bones, the way you know a thing about an animal you've raised from a pup. The high intake would breathe loud up at the tower, and the dead would come across the pasture in the dark toward the sound. And even a full 100 yards away, a blue heeler with a lifetime of guarding this exact ground in his blood was going to hear them coming and do the one thing his whole being was built to do, sound the alarm. And he would sound it down here in a sealed concrete room, where the bark had nowhere in the world to go but straight up the pipes to the surface. Petter had named it on the 4th day. Biscuit will bark, and then they'll know for sure. And every one of us had been quietly, carefully not deciding what to do about that fact for 6 days running. June was the one who finally said it out loud on that last night, in the flat, careful voice that I had come to understand was simply the sound of a girl doing the hard, cold arithmetic that the grown-ups kept flinching away from. "We can't keep him quiet by holding him," she said. "He's too strong, and he's too smart, and he loves us too much. If he thinks we're in danger, he is going to try to save us the only way he knows. And that's with his voice. So it's one of 2 things. Either we let him bark, and we probably lose everything." She stopped. She did not say the other thing. She didn't have to. Petter had already gone white as the concrete and wrapped both his arms all the way around the dog's neck and pressed his face down into the fur. I want to tell you that I found a third way. In most of the stories I've heard people tell since around the barrels, in the resettlement lines, wherever survivors gather and lie, a little to make the past bearable, there's always a third way. Some clever trick that saves the dog and the family both. That lets a man keep his hands clean and his heart whole. There was no third way for us. There was a muzzle, and there was the plain fact that a muzzled dog still whines and thrashes and drives his claws on the concrete. And there was the sealed pipe standing ready to carry every one of those sounds, faithfully up to the surface. I sat with the very worst version of that decision for a full hour in the dark, turning it over. And I'm not going to pretend to you that I didn't. I did. And then Ilsa, my quiet, practical arithmetic of the problem wife, reached over in the dark and took my hand in both of hers and pulled it to her mouth and said, so soft I felt it more than heard it. We do not do that to him. And we do not do it to Petter, who would watch. And we do not do it to ourselves, because we would have to be the people who did it after for the rest of our lives. We find another way to be quiet, or we die honest as ourselves. And that was the decision, made not by me, but by her. And I have never loved her more, or been more glad to be overruled. We would not trade the dog for our lives. We would gamble instead. We would bet everything on 100 yards of dark pasture and a decoy tower being enough. And if the dog barked and it turned out not to be enough, then it wasn't enough. And we would meet whatever came up out of the dark as the actual people we were, and not as people who'd already surrendered the best part of themselves to buy a few more days. I have weighed that choice every single day since. I've never once landed anywhere solid on whether it was right or reckless, whether Ilsa saved our souls or nearly cost us our lives, or both. If you've ever had to set the thing you love most against the odds it stacks against you, I would genuinely like to hear in the comments how you carried the weight of it, because I'm still carrying mine. We chose to throw the valve at 3 a.m, the deadest, coldest hour, when the plains air up high would be moving its cleanest, and the things below might, if the ham operator had been wrong, be at their slowest, though he'd said cold didn't touch them. And I believed him, and I planned for him to be right. We wetted a rag in the cistern and tied it loose over Biscuit's muzzle. Not a real muzzle. Nothing that would panic him. Just enough cloth to soften a full bark down into a smothered woof if it came to that. Petter took the dog and got down on the floor with him and wrapped himself around the animal, chest to back, his hands ready at the snout. Ilsa got down and wrapped herself around Petter. June knelt beside the open grill with the flashlight held steady, her jaw set. And I put my hand on the lever, and I looked once around the yellow lantern light at every face in my family, and I threw the valve from low to high. The sound was immediate, and it was terrible. It came from inside the wall, first a great, hollow, rushing groan, as the blower, which I'd already started cranking, suddenly stopped pulling from the short, low duct and hauled its air instead down 30 feet of galvanized pipe from the top of the windmill tower. The whole column of pipe caught the draw and resonated. It moaned. It moaned like a cello string the size of a house. A deep vibrating note that I felt in my back teeth and in the concrete under my knees. And I knew I could see it as clear as if I stood in the pasture, that the exact same moan was pouring up and out of the mouth of that pipe at the top of the tower, out into the dead, black, still air, a sound no natural thing on that land had ever made in 1,000 years. And underneath the moan, immediately, in a rush, the air in the room changed. I cannot properly tell you what clean, cold, moving prairie air tasted like, after 6 days of breathing rot and our own used breath. June started to cry without a single sound, just tears sheeting down her steady face while she held that flashlight rock still. Petter dragged in one enormous, shaking breath. Even the dog stopped straining and lay quiet, nostrils working at the good air. And then, faint through the concrete wall, drifting down from up the rise, we heard them answer the tower. It began as one voice, and became many inside of a minute. A low, collective, wet moan. Hungry, rising and folding over itself. Sliding down the slope of the rise as the things that had been scattered loose across my whole land turned, all of them at once, toward the one place in the dark that was making a sound. I heard them start to move, not toward the hatch, toward the tower, toward the moaning pipe up the hill. Exactly, precisely as my grandfather had written it down almost 60 years before. Exactly as I had planned it. The decoy was working, and it was the most sickening success of my entire life. Because I was kneeling in the dark, listening to a dozen, and then more than a dozen dead things converge on a windmill, 100 yards from my sleeping son. Drawn there by air, I was pushing up to them on purpose with my own 2 arms. And I was breathing that same clean air down here, cold and alive and full of the far-off smell of the open world. And God help me, I was glad. I was glad, and I was ashamed of being glad, and I kept cranking. Biscuit growled. Low, deep, a rumble that started in his chest and built, his whole body going rigid under Petter's arms as the sound of the massing dead reached him. Petter clamped both hands down over the wet rag on the dog's snout and pressed his own forehead hard against the animal's skull and whispered something into his ear that I couldn't hear. On, a steady stream of it. And the growl stayed a growl and did not climb into a bark, held right there at the edge by the will and the love of a terrified 11-year-old boy. I have never in my life been prouder of anyone than I was of my son in that moment, holding the line between us and the end of everything with nothing at all but his small hands and the whole of his heart. We ran the high intake for 3 hours, long enough to flush the poisoned room completely, to fill our blood back up with real oxygen, to feel like human beings again instead of animals slowly going under. And for the whole 3 hours, we listened to them work at the base of the tower up the hill, 100 yards off, moaning and shoving and pressing. And once the long screech of one of them getting a grip on the cold steel and climbing part way up a leg before the mass of them below dragged it back down. They never came to the hatch, not once, not one of them, the whole 3 hours. The tower had them. My grandfather's clever, loud, terrible second intake had taken our single worst vulnerability and turned it into a wall of sound that held the dead at bay a football field away. And I knelt there and cranked that heavy flywheel until my arms failed me, and Ilsa took the crank from my hands. And then June took it from hers, all of us cranking in turn through the small hours, feeding the tower, keeping the decoy alive, keeping the whole hungry weight of it pointed uphill and away from our door. That was the night I finally understood what the shelter truly was. Not a box that hid us. It was a machine that let us choose where the danger got pointed. And a machine like that only ever works for exactly as long as the person running it is willing to keep making the choice, over and over, hour after hour, with their own 2 hands on the crank. By the 9th day, we had a system. And the system was the most exhausting thing I have ever lived inside of. We could not simply run the high intake around the clock, because every hour it ran renewed the tower's pull on the dead, and we could hear the crowd up there thickening with every burst, more of them arriving from farther and farther off, wandering in off the interstate and down from the county roads, and across whole miles of black, flat country, drawn to a sound that carries the way sound only carries at night on the plains. When the air is still and the land is flat, and there is nothing in 100 directions to stop it. If I ran the tower forever, we'd eventually build up a mass at the top of the rise so large that some of them would spill down off it and begin to wander loose in the flat, and wandering dead things find piles of lumber, and piles of lumber have hatches under them. So we ran it in careful bursts, 2 hours on, to flush the room and bank the good air deep in our blood. Then off, high intake sealed, low intake still sealed, the whole room closed up tight. And we'd lie down in the center of the floor, in the good air we'd stored in ourselves and in the room, breathing shallow and slow, waiting, letting the tower fall silent, letting the crowd up the rise lose the thread of the sound and start to drift and thin and wander back off across the land before we ran it again. It was a rationing of noise, is what it was. We rationed sound the exact way we rationed water and food, by the measured unit. And June kept the ledger of it. She ran it, honestly, better than I could have, because she had the exact temperament the job demanded. Patient, exact, unwilling to fudge a number. She kept the log in Ilse's book, marking the minutes of every burst, and she began to track how long after we cut the intake it took before the moaning up the rise died back down. She learned the rhythm of the thing, the way you learn the rhythm of any machine you tend. She worked out that a 2-hour burst pulled the crowd in tight and took about 5 hours of full silence afterward to disperse them enough to safely run again. And she built us a schedule off of it, wrote it right in the ledger, hours and minutes, and enforced it as fiercely as she enforced the food. My 15-year-old daughter became the engineer of our survival, and she did it with a flat, careful face and a stub of pencil, and I let her have the whole of it, because she was plainly better at it than I was, and because it gave her something solid to close her hands around that wasn't fear. Peter held the dog. That was his entire job, around the whole clock, and he did it without a single complaint. And somewhere in those grinding days, the boy and the animal fused into one quiet unit, so close that they seemed to breathe together. And Biscuit, I will swear to the truth of this to anyone who asks, learned the rules. He learned that the growl was permitted, but the bark was forbidden. That when the boy's small hands came up to his snout, he was to swallow the sound down into his chest and hold it there. A dog came to understand the strategic situation we were living inside of. That is a small thing to say, and it is the thing that kept us all breathing. And I will not have anyone tell me it isn't so. On the 9th night, the radio handed us the thing that broke our whole careful, exhausting, beautiful system wide open. And it came, of all the ways it could have come, as a living human voice. I'd been running the shortwave in short bursts too, sparingly, hoarding the batteries, mostly catching nothing but the tone and the same recorded loops we'd learned by heart. But that 9th night, during a 2-hour intake burst when the tower was moaning full and the crowd was thick and loud up the rise, I caught a live transmission close, strong, unmistakably a man, talking in real time, riding in on the ham band where it bled across the shortwave. And he was calling out grid squares, and a phrase, the same phrase over and over. Any shelter in the Murdo Draper corridor, we are running an extraction. 1 pass only. We are marking safe structures as we go. Respond with your position if you can. We are running an extraction. And then a string of coordinates. And then it again and again. I sat up so fast, I knocked the lantern over and had to grab it. Because the coordinates weren't near us. They were us, our section, our range and township. The exact square mile of God's earth that the horse pasture and the shelter and the windmill tower all sat inside of. There were people out there, living organized, moving people, with the ability to drive a route and pull survivors out of it. And they were passing through our forgotten corner of nowhere, and they were asking anyone alive to tell them where they were. One pass only, and to answer them, to tell them where I would need to key up a transmitter and send, which I did not have. The old Zenith was a receiver, only a receiver, built to listen to the far side of the world and never to speak a word back to it. We could hear rescue calling our own township across the dark, and we had no voice on earth to answer it with. Except we did. I understood it all at once, sitting there in the spilled yellow light with the whole family staring at me. We had a voice that reached the surface. We'd been using it for 6 days straight. We had the tower. The high intake made a sound at the surface. A loud, strange, distinctive, deeply unnatural sound. A resonant moan that no man had ever in his life heard a windmill make. A sound so wrong that it had drawn the dead across whole miles of prairie to gather beneath it. It was a beacon. It had been a beacon for the dead this entire time. And a man running an extraction, driving slow through a black dead plain in the dead of night, scanning the dark for any single sign of the living. That man would notice a windmill tower breathing like a foghorn. And if I ran it long and hard, and in a shape that a machine would never make on its own, it would tell the living exactly, precisely where we were. And running it long and hard and in a shape would call every dead thing left standing within 20 miles to the top of that rise. That was the choice, and I want to set it in front of you as clean and cold as it sat in front of me, because it was the truest fork of my whole life. And I don't want to make it sound easier than it was. Stay silent, keep hidden, keep to June's rationing schedule, keep the bursts short, keep drifting the crowd off and on, and wait out the outbreak underground for however many weeks or months it took, safe on our deep stores of food and water, safe for exactly as long as our arms held out on the crank. And the dog held his voice, and none of us got sick and let the one and only pass of the rescue roll by in the dark, unanswered, and never in this life know whether it had been our single chance at getting out. Or run the tower like a beacon, all night. No rationing, no schedule, no drifting them off. Build the beacon up into a scream that a passing rescuer might hear, and that 1,000 dead things absolutely, certainly would. And gamble the entire family on the truck, reaching the top of our rise before the crowd reached our door. Ilse said it first, quiet and even. If we call them, and they do not come if we are wrong, if they turn off before they reach us, if the truck breaks, then we have drawn everything on this land to us for nothing. And after that, the tower can never go quiet again, because they'll be here at the hatch, all of them. We could not hide again. We would be finished. Every word of it true, every single word. June answered her just as level. But if we don't call them, and the outbreak doesn't end, and nothing on that radio in 9 days has said it's going to end, then we die down here anyway, slower. When the food finally runs out, or Dad's arm gives out on the crank, or the day comes, Biscuit finally barks. Hiding isn't the same thing as surviving. It's just choosing to die later, in the dark, where nobody will ever know we were here. Also true. Every word of that, also true, Petter said, with the dog's heavy head resting in his lap and his hand moving slow through the fur. How long do dead people last? Do they run out, eventually, like batteries? And not one of us knew. That was the whole black heart of the terror of it. Nobody knew if the outbreak was a thing you could outlast by hiding or a thing you had to be physically pulled out of. The ham operator, weeks gone now and probably dead himself, had said they don't stop for cold. If they didn't stop for cold, and they didn't stop for time, then hiding was only a slower door into the very same room. And the rescue driving through our township tonight was the only other door out of the whole building. And it was rolling past this minute, one pass only. I made the call. I'd told you I'd stop lying to my family, and I'd kept that. So I told them straight, no softening. I'm going to run the tower as a beacon. I believe that rescue is real. I believe this is the only pass we get. And I believe that staying hidden forever down here is just a way of dying that lets us feel like we're being careful. I could be wrong about all of it. If I'm wrong, I've killed us tonight. But I would rather bet everything I have on the people out there being real than spend whatever's left of our lives in this hole, waiting for the food to run out, listening to the dead learn our schedule. Nobody argued. Ilsa put her flat, warm hand between my shoulder blades and left it there. And June, because she was exactly who she was down to the ground, picked her pencil back up and said, "Then we do it right. We don't just run it steady, because a steady moan is what a broken windmill sounds like, and they'll drive right past it like they did before. We run it in a pattern, 3 long, 3 short, over and over. So they know it's a person choosing to do it and not a machine that's just breaking down." My daughter turned our air supply into a signal. 3 long, 3 short, she said it didn't have to be real Morse. Didn't have to mean a word. It only had to be a shape that no dying machine on Earth would ever make. A rhythm that said out loud, into the dark, someone alive is choosing this. And I put my hand on the lever and threw it to high. And I began. 3 long pulls of the crank at full draw, and then 3 short, 3 long, and 3 short, while Ilsa took up the dead microphone of the shortwave that connected to nothing, and spoke our position into it anyway, over and over, our township and range and section, just to be doing something with her hands and her voice, just in case. And Petter got down on the floor and wrapped himself around the dog. The dead came. God in heaven, they came. Inside the first hour, the moaning up the rise had doubled, and then I lost all ability to count it. By the 3rd hour, it was no longer a crowd. It was a sound like surf on a shore, a steady, unbroken, wet roar rolling down off the top of the rise. And I could feel it now through the concrete against my knees. A low vibration. The sheer physical mass of them shoving against the base of the tower and against each other. Drawn out of every direction across the black flatland by a beacon I was pumping up into the night with my own burning shoulders. And the tower held them mostly, 100 yards up the rise. But not all of them. Not anymore. On the 4th hour, we heard the first ones down in the flat with us, dragging feet on the gravel, a body blundering into the side of the machine shed. And then a weight, settling on the lumber over the hatch. And the scraped 5 fingers, dragging across a board, feeling for an edge. Biscuit's whole body went to iron. Petter clamped down over the rag, forehead to the dog's skull, whispering and weeping and holding. And the growl built in the animal's chest, like an engine turning over and did not break. I kept cranking, 3 long, 3 short, my arms gone past pain into a numb far country where they were just 2 pieces of the machine. And June counted under her breath, and Ilsa spoke our name into the dark, and above us, the thing on the hatch scraped and scraped at the boards. And I understood we had minutes, only minutes, before the dead in the flat worked out that the small, hollow sound of a family under a pile of lumber was a better thing than the big, empty singing tower up the hill. And then, riding in over the roar, over the moaning, over the blood pounding in my own ears, I heard an engine. Not a dead sound. A living sound, a big diesel, laboring, climbing a grade, and then light. The first light we had seen in 9 days came sliding down through the pipe of the high intake in a single, thin, gray thread, as headlights swept across the top of the rise. And a horn. A truck horn. 3 long, 3 short, answering June's made-up pattern back to us out of the dark, throwing her own signal back down the throat of the windmill pipe. And I have never in my life heard anything, before that night or since, one half as beautiful as the sound of a stranger's air horn honking my daughter's invented code back to us down 100 years of my family's pipe. What happened next happened fast, and I only ever had pieces of it, because I was underground with my hand locked on a lever and my family in the middle of a concrete room, and everything came to us through the wall as sound. There was the diesel, close now, and shouting men's voices, hard and quick, calling to each other. And then a sound I knew in my bones. The flat, hard crack of rifles, a lot of them, fired in short, disciplined bursts, not the panicked emptying of a magazine, but men who knew exactly what they were doing. The whole crowd at the tower had turned toward the truck, toward the lights and the engine and the horn. The beacon had done its entire job all at once. It had gathered the dead into one place at the top of the rise. And then the living had driven straight up into that place with lights and a horn and rifles. And the 2 things I had summoned out of the dark met each other 100 yards from my son. And there was nothing left for us to do but kneel in the room and listen to it and wait. Then boots. Running. Coming down off the rise into the flat, coming toward us, and a voice, a real living voice right over the hatch, out of breath and urgent. Aldous? Warren Aldous? Anybody alive down there? And the lumber, scraping and clattering as it was thrown clear, board by board. And I was up the 12 concrete steps with my hand on the interior bolt, and I stopped. I stopped with my fingers on the steel. Because in 9 days underground, I had learned, down in a place deeper than thought, not to open that hatch. And even now, even hearing my own name in a living man's mouth, my hand would not throw the bolt on nothing but faith. I put my mouth to the seam of the door, and I said, "Prove you're not one of them." And the man on the other side, God bless him for it, every day of my life did not argue. He did not say, "Trust me." He did not say, "There's no time, open the door." He laughed. A short, ragged, bone-tired laugh, and he said, "Buddy, one of them wouldn't stop to ask you to prove anything. It'd already be coming through the door. We've got maybe 90 seconds before the rest of that herd loses interest in the truck and remembers you. You can stay down there and be right, or you can come up and be alive. Your call, but make it now." And that was the most human thing another person had said to me in 9 days. And I threw the bolt. I am not going to dress up the next 4 minutes for you. We came up out of the ground into a cold, clear South Dakota night that stank of the dead and of diesel exhaust and of gunpowder, into stars so hard and bright and indifferent overhead that they made my eyes water after so long in the dark. There were 3 men in mismatched gear with rifles slung and ready, breathing hard, faces streaked. There was a big grain truck idling rough on the flat, with its bed racked out into a kind of welded cage, a survivor cage. And up the rise, black against the stars, the windmill tower still stood. And it was still moaning its clean air up into the night, with no one left to crank it, because I'd left the blower spinning down slow on its own heavy flywheel. And the crowd, the herd, the man had called it, was already pouring back down off the rise toward the flat, toward us, toward the truck and the sudden absence of the horn, a moving wall of shapes coming across my own pasture under the starlight. We ran. Ilsa with Petter's hand crushed in hers, Petter with Biscuit's rope wrapped twice around his fist, June with the ledger jammed into the waistband of her jeans because she would not leave behind the record of what we had lived through. And me, last of all. And the three men laying down short, controlled bursts of rifle fire to open a lane through the dark for us to run down. And we made the truck. And Hans hauled us up over the tailgate into the cage. And the diesel bellowed, and we lurched away across the section road with the dead closing in over the spot where we'd stood, pouring down into the open stairwell, spilling into the room that had kept us alive for 9 days, filling it up. I watched it fill in the truck's side mirror as we pulled away, watched the dark shapes stream down into my grandfather's shelter, and I felt something I've never been able to put a name to. Grief, I suppose. But grief for a concrete box. Grief for a dead man's careful hands. Grief for the last safe place on all the earth going dark behind me. The man who'd called my name held onto the cage rail next to me as the truck bucked and slammed over the ruts, and he leaned in and shouted over the engine. "How'd you know to do that? 3 and 3?" And I couldn't speak yet, so I just lifted my chin toward June, who sat with her back against the cab of the truck, flat, careful face turned to the road unrolling behind us, watching it the exact way she'd watched the hatch on the very first night. The ledger clutched in her lap, and the man looked at my 15-year-old daughter for a long moment. And he nodded, slow, like a man filing something away that he'd want to remember, and he said, "That windmill's been calling for 9 days straight. We ran this corridor twice before tonight, and both times we clocked it and figured it for a busted mill just moaning in the wind. Tonight it went 3 and 3. And I knew a broke machine doesn't count to 3. Only a person counts to 3. And I thought about my grandfather, 60 years back, writing in his notebook by lantern light that whatever is out there hears the tower breathe, and how he'd set it down as a danger, a thing to fear, and how 60 years later that exact danger was the one and only thing that let the living find us alive in the dark. And I understood, riding in that cage, that nothing my family ever built is only ever one thing. The same pipe that broadcast us to the dead broadcast us to the living. The same air that could kill us was the air that saved us. The same shelter that hid us was the tomb we would have died in if we'd been careful enough to stay. We did not drive to some fenced camp with cots and lights and answers. I'll be honest with you about that, because the stories that end at the fortress on the hill are the stories people want to hear and not the ones that actually happened. The 3 men were neighbors and a cousin from up around Phillip. Ordinary men running the corridor in a grain truck, pulling out whoever they could reach, faring between a handful of ranches that had banded up together. And there was no cure and no army coming, and no all clear on any band. There were just people who had decided that the only way through the thing was to keep the truck running and keep answering the ones who called out. The outbreak did not end that night. If I'm being fully honest with you, it hasn't ended now. Not the way people mean when they ask me. But we were out. And we were together, all 4 of us, and the dog, every one of us. And we were among the living, instead of alone with the dead. And after 9 days underground, and I'd learned that this is the entire difference between the 2 states of being. That survival is not a place you finally reach and lock behind you. It's a thing you keep on choosing, hour after hour, with your own 2 hands. And that other people, when they turn out to be real, are the only version of it that lasts. I think about the shelter more than I think about almost anything. I've come to believe my grandfather built it to keep the world out. And it did that. For 9 days, better than he ever could have dreamed. But it was built by a man alone, for a threat that came from the sky and then went away again. And the threat we got came on foot and did not go away. And a box built by a man for himself alone is a slow tomb for a family in a world like the one we woke up in. What saved us in the end wasn't the concrete, and it wasn't the door. It was the second intake, the flawed one, the loud one, the one my grandfather almost apologized for in his own notebook, the one that reached out to the surface and made a sound. It was the reaching out. It was June's pattern. 3 long and 3 short. It was a stranger who laughed at my door instead of lying to me. Every single thing that kept us breathing was the shelter's opening, not its ceiling. So that's what happened across the 12 days, 9 of them underground. And 3 more on the road in the back of a grain truck before we reached the others up near Phillip. And I've told it to you straight. The whole of it, because I owe it to Del Corliss, whose screaming I heard and did not answer. And I owe it to a blue healer named Biscuit, who understood our situation better than most grown men would have. And I owe it most of all to a dead man's water-stained notebook, which talked me through the 3 worst nights of my life across a span of 60 years and a headstone in the Draper Cemetery. If you'd been down there, if it had been your family, your air going bad 4 times a day, your 1 door and your 1 pipe, and your 1 good dog liable to bark at the very worst moment, I'd honestly like to know whether you'd have run the tower as a beacon or kept it dark and stayed hidden. I have never once fully decided that I was right. And wherever in the world you happen to be listening from tonight, if a story like this one is the kind of thing you come here looking for, then stay with this channel. And tell me down in the comments about the place you'd choose to sit and wait if the wind ever stopped on you the wrong way. Because it does stop sometimes. And when it does, you want to already know where the door is. And you want to already know that a door opens both ways, long before you ever need it to. The last thing, and then I'll let you go, months after all of it, one of the men from that truck went back down through the corridor on a run. And he passed our section. And afterward he came and found me and told me the windmill tower was still standing up there on the rise, and the hatch was still lying open, and the dead had mostly moved on the way they do, drifting off toward some other sound, and then away again from the silence. And then he told me the strangest thing I've ever been told. He said that on a still, cold night, if the wind lies down just right, and a stray gust catches the old blower's flywheel and turns it a few slow revolutions down that empty pipe, the tower will still breathe, just now and again. But it comes out wrong now, he said. It goes 3 long, and then it dies. Not 3 and 3, just the 3, and then nothing at all. Like the first half of a signal that never got the chance to send its second half. Going out over an empty black plain, once in a great while, to anyone left alive out there to hear it. I hope somebody does hear it someday. I hope they lie awake and hear those 3 long notes come across the flat land and know, the way that man knew, that a broken machine doesn't count. I hope they come up out of whatever hole they're hiding in and answer it, 3 and 3, and go looking through the dark until they find each other. Because that, in the end, when everything else had failed, was the only thing that ever worked. Not the walls, not the 18 inches of concrete, the calling out, and the ones who called back,